The Subcommittee on Information Technology and the Subcommittee on Government Operations will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. And we expect a vote series during the middle of this hearing, so we'll try to get through as much testimony as we can, and then go for votes and come back for questioning. And as ranking members Kelly and Connolly arrive, we'll have them offer their opening remarks. Good afternoon. Thanks for being here today. We've got a pretty crowded house. This committee has investigated and explored issues at the forefront of this nation's security with the data breach at OPM, the future of our commercial sector and drones, and the ever-evolving capacity for our technological innovators in as collegial and bipartisan a way as possible. Today's topic is no different, because while we may disagree on the size and scope of the federal government, we can all agree on the importance of understanding how government spends taxpayer dollars. Enacted in May 2014, the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act, or DATA Act, is an important step in leveraging technological capabilities and know-how to make financial spending information accessible to the general public. If implemented properly, the DATA Act will allow anyone from public policy experts and journalists to academics and average citizens, even members of Congress such as myself, to untangle the web of federal agency receipts, appropriations, obligations, and allotments to create a clear picture of government spending. This is an ambitious goal, to be sure, and we are here today to examine the progress that Treasury and the Office of Management and Budget have made in implementing the DATA Act. Whereas prior reform efforts have faltered the work of the Executive Steering Committee and the fact that OMB and Treasury have met the statutory deadlines for issuing data standards and the Consolidated Receipt Reporting Pilot Program give me hope that we are on the right track. While it's certainly important to meet statutory deadlines, agencies also have an obligation to make sure they are implementing bills correctly, not just on time. The use of standardized data has revolutionized entire industries and drives multi-million-dollar decisions and transactions in the private sector on a daily basis. Similarly, accurate data will help drive efficient decision-making at all levels of the government. I thank the witnesses for their testimony today, and I'm looking forward to working with them to effectively implement the DATA Act and realize the benefits of true transparency in federal spending. Now, it's an honor to recognize my friend from the great state of North Carolina, Mr. Meadows, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Government Operations, for his opening statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing, for your leadership on this effort. Thank each of you for coming. Obviously, some of this is not your first rodeo for many of you. Welcome back, and it's nice to meet some of you I'm just meeting today for the first time. Obviously, the Government Accountability Office and others have consistently reported that data on the federal spending is often incomplete, out of date, and inaccurate. This lack of accurate, reliable, consistent data makes it difficult, if not impossible, to properly evaluate whether taxpayer dollars are being wasted or wisely spent. And in this era of very tight fiscal concern, when you're trying to make decisions on where money is to be appropriated and where it should go, having good record keeping and good tools to make informed decisions is critical. In just 5 years, GAO had identified wasteful duplication, overlap, fragmentation in 106 areas across the government, and an additional 72 areas of potential cost savings. Each year, Mr. Daddario, we get your report, and it is illuminating. The only troubling thing is that it seems like a lot of times those things continue to stay on there. So hopefully today's hearing will help us better implement a law that was initiated right here in this committee, one that I think will provide great tools for OMB and others as we look forward to that. To give you an example, the EPA has 37 different laboratories managed by 15 different EPA officials spread across 30 cities and 170 buildings without any coordination. Now, if that is not a recipe for disaster, I can't imagine what it would be, because just the duplicative nature of that is one thing being done here. I can just imagine what we've got. So it is with this duplication and the types of efficiencies that we want to make sure that we have, that the GAO could not even tell the taxpayers where dollars were being wasted at the EPA because they didn't maintain sufficient documentation on the operating data. Well, it's not just there. As many of you know, the Social Security Administration is required to offset benefits for certain individuals who receive similar benefits under another program, like workers' compensation. In 2012, GAO found that the Social Security Administration was not effectively administering the workers' compensation offset due to a lack of information about which recipients were receiving what benefits. And in an 8-year period, it was estimated that some $43 million in disability insurance overpayments were made. Those are just a few examples that we have. The Data Act requires that federal agencies need to maintain and report federal spending data in a format that will allow for good government watchdogs to weed out the waste and the fraud. And if implemented correctly, we will finally know how much our government is spending and where the money is being spent. I think today's hearing, we're looking forward to you illuminating those particular issues as we see, even with that law that has been in effect a little over a year now, is not really taking hold to give us the tools to make informed decisions. So we look forward to you sharing what we can do better to help you implement it and ultimately help the American people. With that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Meadows. And now it's my pleasure to do something I get to do almost every week, and that's recognize the distinguished gentlewoman from the great state of Illinois, and my friend Robin Kelly, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Information Technology, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank you for holding this hearing to examine the progress of the implementation of the Data Act. I would also like to thank each of our witnesses for coming to address us today. Effective implementation of the Data Act is crucial in order to improve the transparency of federal spending. The Act requires that agencies report spending data in a consistent way, which in turn will help them operate more efficiently. The transparency that the Data Act is designed to provide will help hold agencies accountable for their spending decisions. Comptroller General Gene Daddario testified before this committee last year that the Data Act was one of the single biggest things Congress could do to address wasteful spending. OMB and Treasury have taken major steps forward in carrying out the requirements of this Act. I applaud the way the administration has embraced the Act and worked so diligently over the last year to set the executive branch on the right path. In the last hearing concerning this topic, David Meadows, the Comptroller for the Office of Management and Budget, stated, and I quote, "We have charted a very aggressive path towards implementation, building off past experiences and successes to transform the way the government does business." Mr. Meadows is here with us again today, along with Mr. Lieber from the Treasury Department. I look forward to hearing from them how well OMB and Treasury are progressing. OMB and Treasury got off to a great start by meeting the first big deadline, which required them to establish government-wide data standards by May 9, 2015. I want to highlight the efforts the administration has taken to get feedback from stakeholders and provide opportunities for public comments over the past year. Stakeholder input is crucial to ensuring the success of the Data Act. This Act is an initiative that encourages innovation. Including stakeholders in the discussion will help foster that innovation both inside and outside the government. I also want to commend the way the GAO and the Office of Inspector General for Treasury has engaged early in the process. I know both GAO and the OIG already have work underway to assess implementation efforts. The work of Congress did not end with the passage of the Data Act. It is our duty to stay engaged and see that the execution of the Act happens seamlessly. We must keep our finger on the pulse of the agencies to assure them that they have our support and guidance, as well as the resources they need to ensure the law is carried out as it was intended. Again, I welcome the witnesses, and I thank the Chairman for holding this bipartisan hearing, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Kelly. Now it's an honor to welcome the Honorable Gene Daddario, Comptroller General of the United States, the U.S. Government Accountability Office. He's no stranger to this committee. It's great to have you here, and he's going to be accompanied by Christopher Mim, the Managing Director of Strategic Issues at the GAO, whose expertise may be needed during this hearing. The next person I'd like to introduce is the Honorable David Mader, the Controller of the Office of Federal Financial Management at OMB, and Mr. David Lieber, the Fiscal Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Treasury. Thank you for being here today. It was great meeting you earlier this morning. And Mr. Robert Taylor is our fourth panelist, the Deputy Assistant Inspector General for Audit at the U.S. Department of Treasury. Thank you for being here today. And pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. We will also swear in Mr. Mim. Please rise and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Please be seated. And let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written record and your written statement will be made part of the record. And I'd like to recognize Mr. Daddario for his opening remarks for 5 minutes. Welcome, sir.
I want to thank you for holding this hearing and asking for GAO to participate. The Data Act, if effectively implemented, can really enhance the transparency and accountability of government and lead to more efficient and effective government operations. Treasury and OMB have gotten off to a good start. I think they've taken some significant steps. They've issued 27 of an eventual 57 data elements that plan to be implemented by the end of this summer. So that's very important. Now, we've given them a lot of technical suggestions and that could lead to some revisions. The intent of our effort to engage early is to make sure that we get a good solid foundation in the beginning, to make sure that the standards are clear, they can be consistently applied, and will produce the desired result over time. So we plan to continue to provide them ongoing feedback to achieve those objectives. But much more needs to be done in order to effectively implement the Act. Today, I'd like to focus my opening remarks on 3 recommendations that we've made in our written testimony. One is we think OMB and Treasury need to accelerate the efforts to merge the Data Act standards requirements with the requirement in the Government Performance Results Act to ensure that the government has a complete inventory of federal programs. The federal government still does not have this. We need an inventory of federal programs so that Congress can collectively look at the aggregate investment the federal government is making in federal programs and activities. And also, if we are going to efficiently and effectively be able to reduce fragmentation, overlap, and duplication in the federal government. It's critical that this inventory be developed so that federal spending can be linked to federal programs and activities. Secondly, we encourage Treasury and OMB to establish a permanent governance structure for the life cycle of the standards to ensure that they're enforced, that their integrity is maintained over time, and that they use leading practices in data governance that have been used by standard-setting bodies throughout the world. And we've made that recommendation. I think it's very important. Treasury and OMB have a good initial governance structure, but they have yet to establish how it's going to be permanently done over time. Now, I think it's very important to do it now because the implementation of the Data Act will span the next 2 administrations. And I'm concerned that there will be lost momentum and lack of direction to the agencies without that permanent governance structure being in place now that can transcend the transition to the new administration. Thirdly, Treasury and OMB have outreach to stakeholders, but we think there's more that could be done in this area that would effectively replicate a lot of good practices that were established during the Recovery Act. There needs to be a two-way dialogue between Treasury, OMB, and the agencies and various stakeholders, particularly at the state and local level, non-for-profit level, the contracting community, and we believe that Treasury and OMB need to provide feedback to them based upon their suggestions. That hasn't happened to date. We think that that dialogue is important. The initial standards were more focused on Federal Government budget data and requirements so that there's not yet a lot of standards that are going to affect the recipient community. Those will be coming out or have been coming out now, so it's very important to get this dialogue up and running effectively over time. Lastly, I would say there needs to be continued attention by this committee and the administration to ensure that these standards are effectively implemented. We can come up, and OMB and Treasury and the government come up with the best standards in the world, but unless they're implemented effectively, you're not going to have accurate data. Chairman Meadows mentioned our work in the past about the inaccurate and incomplete data on usaspending.gov. It significantly we found it to be incomplete and inaccurate, and unless attention is made to effectively implementing the standards, I'm afraid that we could have the same very poor result after a lot of good intentions and good efforts to get the Data Act implemented. So, long way to go. GAO will be there every step of the way, and I thank you for the opportunity. I'd be happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Mader, you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Hurd, Ranking Member Kelly, and Chairman Meadows for the opportunity to be here today to talk about the progress that OMB and Treasury have been making since our last appearance in December with the implementation of the Data Act. I think, as you stated, Mr. Chairman, the Act presents a unique opportunity to improve the way the government works by providing all Americans with the ability to see how Federal dollars are spent. By delivering access to reliable financial information through USA Spending, the Data Act will provide, and both individuals and organizations in and outside of government, to understand how the nation's tax dollars are being spent and provide opportunities to create innovative solutions for improving the efficiency and effectiveness and oversight of how the government does its business. Equally important, increasing transparency will enhance intergovernment and intragovernmental communication, allowing for more informed, effective, and efficient decision-making. Access to standardized data will improve the efforts of Federal, state, local, and tribal governments, as well as all other stakeholders. We believe the Data Act's statutory requirements are driven by 3 clear goals. First, continuing to improve how the Federal Government accounts for and displays total spending. Second, institutionalize a culture of data-driven decision-making. And third, re-examine how we can lessen the burden on Federal contract and grant recipients and their reporting burden. Since last December, we've had an opportunity to make significant progress. Since our December meeting here, there are significant actions that have been accomplished. First, we continue to work to improve USA Spending's government interface. 2, we established government-wide USA Spending data definitions and data exchange standards for all Federal spending. 3rd, we developed an agency playbook to assist agencies in the Data Act implementation. 4th, we issued guidance to agencies to systemically improve data quality. And 5th, we launched a pilot to simplify Federal award reporting. Moving forward from this day, we have significant work ahead of us. 1, we must complete the remaining work for additional data standards, including additional data definitions. 2nd, we need to work with agencies specifically for them to develop implementation plans. 3rd, we need to continue to collaborate with Federal and non-Federal stakeholders to develop the display of Data Act information. And lastly, we need to continue to enhance the Section 5 pilot. As we close out fiscal year 15 and move into fiscal year 16, the success of our ongoing efforts will be contingent on the appropriation of sufficient resources for federal agencies. Thus far, progress made in the implementation of the Data Act has been accomplished using existing resources. In FY16, the President's budget included $84 million for Data Act implementation, which would put us on a strong path towards May of 2017. As you recall, the Congressional Budget Office estimated that the Data Act would cost somewhere around $300 million for the period 2014 through 2018. Without dedicated resources, agencies will have a substantial difficulty in reaching both the statutory requirements and the overall intent of the Data Act. With Congress's continued support, appropriate funding, and continued robust collaboration, we will be on a path for successful Data Act implementation. We look forward to the opportunity to continue to work with GAO, with the IG community, and this committee to ensure that we meet the objectives of the Data Act. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you for your remarks, sir. Mr. Lieber, 5 minutes is yours. Mr. Lieber, can you?
Yep, there we go. Thank you for having us here today to talk about the implementation of the Data Act. In my over 25 years of experience in the federal government, there are a few initiatives I've seen in the financial management area that can make as much of a difference as this Act can across government. When Mr. Mader and I have gone out and spoken to the federal community, I think what we've been struck by is how receptive the federal community has been to getting better access to data. And the underlying premise of our implementation has been better data, better decisions, better government. And I think our ability to actually improve the access to data, to unlock the data that exists in disparate and siloed systems across government, can make a major effort, a major difference in terms of making government operate better, both internally as well as externally with respect to citizens understanding how government's spending their money, as well as seeing ways that we can improve program performance and enhancements. So I think there's really an ample opportunity here, a really good opportunity for us to make a significant difference long-term for how government operates. And when I testified last on this, we talked about the implementation approach we had. And I think, when you have a new piece of legislation and it's as comprehensive and as transformational as this, one of the first things you have to do is articulate what your business approach is and what the business case is of why you want to do this. So Dave and I have spent a lot of time within the federal community talking about the importance of the Act and explaining our approach. And significantly, we've talked about a data-centric approach, which is more about the ability to access the data rather than a systems approach. In the past, government oftentimes builds large-scale systems and attempts to access data or change systems to access data. Our approach has been more data-centric. It's about finding the data that currently exists within existing systems, mapping to that data, and then being able to present it and make it accessible to both government and externally. This has been something that's a little bit new, and as we've gone out and spoken about that, we've had to sort of, once we get people to kind of understand a little bit better, the next question is, what do you want us to do? So part of the implementation has been for us to put together a playbook, and one of the probably smarter things I think we've done was to develop a PMO, a program management office, a small group of people who are very much getting up every morning and going to sleep every night thinking about how can we advance the implementation of the Act. And one of the things that they've done, and the office was established within Treasury, was working closely with OMB, was put together this 8-step plan and saying to the agencies, if you're going to implement the Act, what kinds of things do you need to do? And we're at the very beginning stages of that. In May, when we announced the standards, we also announced the playbook. One of the first things that people need to do is put together a small team to understand where the data resides within their existing systems. And that process, which is underway today, is going well. We've held over 20, we've met with all 24 of the CFO Act agencies. We've met with the IG community, the GAO, and spoken about the implementation and how you need to proceed as an organization to actually get access and start mapping the data. So that's gone very well. We're at the very beginning stages of that, and I think the results of that will give us some indication about how difficult this will be across government over the coming months. What kind of resources are going to be necessary, how easy it is going to be to actually map the data and actually extract it from the different systems. One other philosophical point of view we had in implementation was that we would try pilots, that we would try an agile approach to development, which is more about sprints and failing fast if you're going to fail, and understanding, what's working and what's not working. So we've had a number of pilots that we've been testing, and as it relates to the implementation, those have been very effective at having us learn lessons and moving forward, and we'll be doing more of that. I should also mention that I know we've been getting a lot of very good constructive feedback, and the GAO and our IG, I think it's been very good that they've been involved in this at the beginning to give us quick feedback and allow us to make corrective course corrections as necessary with respect to how we're doing the implementation. We've done a lot of outreach to the community. We've done something new with respect to getting input using something called the GitHub, which is allowing people in real time to actually look at proposals that we have out there and getting us back their comments and their feedback. This is, I think, a useful tool in the sense that it does allow a community of experts to really to be a community and talk about how you actually implement data and use the data. And we've found that a very effective way to move the project forward. There certainly are challenges, and I don't want to suggest this is easy, because it's not. Moving the federal government in a direction, it's going to take resources, as Dave mentioned, but we're very much committed to doing what we can to move this effort forward. I look forward to taking questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Taylor.
Yes, Chairman Hurd, Chairman Meadows, Ranking Member Kelly, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you this afternoon for the hearing on Data Act implementation. I am here to discuss our office's recent oversight report on Treasury's effort under this Act. The Data Act places initial responsibility for implementation squarely on Treasury and OMB, requiring that they issue guidance on government-wide financial data standards for federal spending, ensure financial and payment information data is accurately posted and displayed on USA spending by May 2017, and then ensuring the data standards established are applied to the data made available on this website by May 2018. As the Data Act moved towards passage, Treasury Inspector General Eric Thorson recognized that our office would hold an important oversight role. He asked that we engage Treasury early in this process. In response, we start what will be a series of audits over the next several years focused on Treasury's Data Act efforts. We issued our first report this past May. That report covered actions taken by Treasury as of October 31st, 2014. We found that Treasury and OMB made progress in setting up an implementation approach. For example, Treasury and OMB established an executive steering committee with Mr. Mader and Mr. Lieber. This committee is supported by an interagency advisory committee comprised of representatives from various government-wide communities to provide leadership in obtaining stakeholder buy-in. As Mr. Lieber mentioned, Treasury and OMB also develop a data-centric vision for implementation. This approach focuses on managing existing data to avoid massive system changes across government. To execute the data-centric approach, Treasury and OMB create a structure divided into 4 general areas: lead, implement, support, and consult, with specific work streams under each. While Treasury's progress is notable, we did identify concerns with project management that we believe could hinder implementation. Due to the complexities involved, Treasury is using a combination of Agile and traditional project management practices. Very briefly, Agile is characterized by quick, small-scale pilots to test innovative concepts and strategies to get to an end result. Traditional project management, on the other hand, is a more structured methodology that is characterized by a detailed step-by-step approach done in chronological order to achieve an end product that is clearly defined up front. Conceptually, the combination of these 2 approaches makes sense. However, we know that Treasury's project planning documents did not describe the different practices being used for each identified work stream. It did not clearly show how the tasks in the various work streams tied together produce desired results. Additionally, the planning documents did not fully reflect recognized artifacts, tools, and metrics for either an agile or traditional project management methodology. There were also inconsistencies between the status of activities reflected in certain tracking documents and some documents that we expected to see were either not prepared or not maintained. Furthermore, at the time, Treasury did not have a formal process to track stakeholder feedback. We also know that Treasury had some trouble filling the position of program manager, which may have contributed to some of the concerns we found. However, Treasury did fill this critical role in November 2014. We are pleased to report that in his response to our audit, Mr. Lieber agreed with our recommendations for strengthening project management. I also want to emphasize that the above concerns were as of a point in time, October 31st of last year, and a law has taken place since that time. In closing, I'd like to say that our office views the Data Act as a critical step in providing government managers, the Congress, citizens, and the Inspector Generals and GAO for that matter, with a better tool to evaluate how government is using the resources entrusted to it. We believe that a key component is the strong oversight provision incorporating the Act, specifically that the cognizant Inspector Generals and GAO conduct a series of rigorous reviews to assess the quality of data submitted under the Act. These reviews will hopefully give users comfort in the reliability of the spending information presented, something that is currently lacking with USA spending data. This concludes my statement. I will be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Now I'd like to recognize Chairman Meadows for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank each of you for your testimony. I'm going to start out very briefly and maybe emphasize the reason why Mr. Mader and Mr. Lieber, why it's so critical that we get this information. If you go back to the Waste Book of 2014, it highlights a few things in there, and so I looked at what I found egregious, and then I went and looked to try to find the information on the site for how we would make a decision on whether we should give that grant or not. And so this, I won't mention the institution, but the institution name is there, and it basically is 2 pages of just where they're from and the name of the institution. And then the project description is research in strong interaction theory. Now, I mean, that could mean a lot of things to a lot of people, and so, but that was the extent of the information that we have from the federal government. Well, come to find out, that was a $331,000 project that allowed parents or individuals to stab voodoo dolls with pins so that they could figure out when you're hungry, if you're angrier. Now, most parents who have toddlers know that when they're hungry, they get cranky, and so to spend $331,000 to stick pins in a voodoo doll may be important to someone, but when we have so many unbelievable needs out there, to make an informed decision, we need more data. And so I want to give that example. I've got more, but we won't go into those. So Mr. Daddario, let me come to you. I understand there's some pilot programs that we're trying to implement. What would you believe that a good pilot program would look like?
Well, the characteristics of a good pilot program would be clear objectives of what you would want to test, a defined time frame, clear criteria on how you're going to evaluate the pilot to know whether it was successful or not, and having good data along the way in order to be able to monitor the effective implementation of the pilot and evaluate the results of the pilot.
So basically a matrix of where you're trying to get to, some standards on what those expectations are, and then the quality of the input to see if it measures up to that so you can make an informed decision.
Right, right. And so you can compare it to the existing system to see, make sure it's going to improve the situation.
So as we look to do this in the pilot programs, Mr. Mader, I know you've been working, I guess, with HHS, and what that pilot program, as it's described to me, and it may be wrong, but it seems that it misses the target that Mr. Daddario has, in that it's a blog, and, we're putting up a few things, and we're getting a little bit more information here and there, but it really is not clearly defined. So when it comes from a pilot standpoint, how can, one, where do you see any deficiencies? And I guess the other is how can we go to improve that?
Mr. Chairman, first of all, I agree with Mr. Daddario's description of what the critical elements are for a good pilot. And I think with regard specifically to the Section 5 pilot, which is basically, if we go back to the underlying statute, it basically talked about a pilot and it talks about a report at the end of the period. And when we looked at the statute and we looked at what we know the outcome needed to be, and that really is to reduce the burden on individuals that interact with the government with regard to contracts or with financial assistance and loans. And I think if we had taken a traditional approach of doing a study, what we would have wound up at the end of 2 years is a 3-inch binder with a series of recommendations. And I don't think that would be satisfying to us, nor would it be satisfying to the committee or anybody for that matter. So in thinking about how to construct a pilot with the intent that everybody wants, we said, let's sort of think, and I'll use something that Dave mentioned, is let's take a more iterative approach. Let's start working with the recipients, the stakeholders, and asking them, if you're applying for a grant, what is the burden? How difficult is it? What are things that we could improve? If you're applying, if you're going to bid on a federal contract, how could we make that process easier? So the first part of the strategy is actually to ask the recipients, the stakeholders, what would you fix? What's broken? And that's the step that we have embarked on now. As we gather that input from the stakeholders, then we're going to start looking at the business processes, the business practices, whether it's in financial assistance or in contracting, saying, can we change this? Can we change the practice? Can we do it now instead of 2 years from now? So I do believe that the way we are constructing this pilot adheres to best practices, because we're just getting started. We only began a couple of months ago. But I also think that this iterative approach is actually going to get us real results faster.
Well, I hope you're right. The only problem that I have is if Mr. Daddario's definition of what success is, and you go into the stakeholders who receive the grants and say, how do we make this better, really it doesn't meet the requirements of what a pilot program is supposed to be, with regards to the statute, because it's got some pretty, A, B, and C there in terms of what it needs to do, and it sounds like you haven't really addressed those. Have you addressed those in your pilot?
Mr. Chairman, we're going to.
Have you already addressed them?
No, we're in the process of addressing, but we will address what's required in the statute. But I think we're going to do it in a way that actually will generate real results sooner rather than later.
Oh, I'll yield back since you were very gracious with your time, Mr. Chairman. We'll have a follow-up series of questions.
Ms. Kelly, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Daddario, the Recovery, Accountability, and Transparency Board, in consultation with Inspector Generals, established the Recovery Operations Center, ROC, in 2009. The ROC has been successful in using enforcement and analytics and software tools to identify patterns and identify areas at risk for fraud. For example, the Inspector General for the Department of Homeland Security used ROC to investigate companies that received contracts for debris removal from Hurricane Sandy. The ROC identified contractors who had tax liens and filed for bankruptcy, as well as organizations that committed fraud previously on similar contracts. Do you agree that ROC has been an effective tool in identifying fraud?
Yes.
You said that pretty emphatically.
Well, I would tell you, we were involved in the Recovery Act implementation as well. Our job was to look at the use of the money by state and local governments. But I went over and I saw demonstrations of the ROC's capabilities. I think the Recovery Board and the IGs did an excellent job. I think there was great concern about the amount of potential fraud that could occur, pushing out $800 billion in a short period of time. And I think that their effective implementation of these sets of tools in the Recovery Operations Center led to a relatively minimal amount of identifiable fraud in that program, a lot less than people anticipated.
Thanks. Mr. Taylor, has the ROC also been a valuable service to the Inspector General community?
To some extent, I'm going to defer to GAO on that. I can speak for myself. I have not used it, but they've been doing a body of work looking at the requirements under the Data Act. There is a requirement that Treasury considers setting up a data analytics center. When GAO informed us that they were going to do a study of that, we deferred our work.
Okay, so under the Data Act, Treasury can transfer the assets of the ROC to establish a data analysis center or to simply expand an existing service. So, Mr. Daddario, your written testimony states that the Treasury Department does not plan on transferring any of the ROC's assets. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, they are engaged in transferring information and knowledge from the ROC operations. They've hired one person who had an integral role in the ROC's area, but for various reasons that we cite in our testimony that they told us about the age of the hardware, the proprietary nature of some of the contracts, and et cetera. No, they do not plan at this time, what they've told us, to transfer those assets intact over to their operations.
And Mr. Lieber, is that accurate?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And Mr. Daddario, your testimony identifies 4 categories of assets that could be transferred from the ROC to Treasury. One of those is personnel. Mr. Lieber, has Treasury hired any employees from the ROC?
Yes, we've hired several employees from the ROC, as well as have leveraged significantly kind of what they've learned in the process of operating the ROC.
Okay. Another category of assets Treasury could obtain from the ROC is data sets. And your written testimony includes a chart that shows the data sources available to Treasury do not pay program compared to the data sources available to the ROC. Mr. Lieber, do you agree with GAO's assessment that there are data sets available to the ROC that are not available to Treasury's do not pay program?
And that would be correct in the sense that the ROC had very specific authorities that were not transferred in the Act. The Act actually allows Treasury to take assets, but did not transfer the authorities of the ROC.
And has Treasury taken any steps to use its authority under the Data Act to obtain access to those data sets that the ROC is not, has, but, let me back up, to those data sets that the ROC has, but Treasury does not have?
So it may be useful to sort of talk about how we have approached the issue of improper payments and fraud. Treasury is very much committed to reducing improper payments across government, and we operate something called the Do Not Pay Center. The Do Not Pay Center is more comprehensive than what the ROC is doing, because what Do Not Pay is doing is the over 500 million government payments have already been run through the Do Not Pay Center. That is making sure that you're doing real-time matching against existing government payments, something the ROC was not able to do. The second piece, which is that's important, is in Do Not Pay, we're looking at pre-award. That is, when someone's making a determination about whether they should give an award to someone, they have the ability to come in to Do Not Pay and do an assessment about whether they should give that person an award. They then have the ability, prior to actually issuing an award, to run it against the Do Not Pay databases. And finally, thirdly, there's real-time ability that once payments are being made, to match them against the Do Not Pay database. And then finally, fourth, is the ability, after a payment has been made, to do analysis to figure out whether the payment was appropriate. So we have used the Do Not Pay Center, as well as our existing capabilities in payments, to use that information to do analytics and to stop improper payments, which is much more expansive than what the ROC can do today. Our IG recently gave us an award for the ability to actually help identify and prosecute over 130 cases of fraud that was based on our payment files. So what we're doing right now is we're going by, which is something the ROC did not have the capability of doing, is analyzing all the government payments that are being made. So if a beneficiary has received a payment for the last 10 years to a bank account, and all of a sudden it appears as though it's now going to a prepaid debit card, that may be an indication that there's fraud. In one of the cases that was prosecuted, there were over 10 government payments being made to a single address, and we did geospace coding and sort of said, where is that house that those payments are going to? And turned out it was a warehouse. And you therefore can sort of say, well, those payments shouldn't have been being made to that way, and they're problematic. So we've been working with the IG community to in SIGI to sort of sit down and talk about how can they get better access to do not pay, how can we work with them more closely to provide those services that currently are being provided by the ROC, in addition to further services that we can offer to them to reduce improper payments.
Well, congrats on the award, and my time is up. Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Wahlberg from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just last week, I believe, the Oversight and Government Reform Committee approved the Taxpayer Right to Know Act, which, as you know, establishes a definition for a government program. Seems it's about time that we do that, since we have plenty of programs. It requires OMB to publish an inventory of all programs as well as its activities online. And so, Mr. Daddario, can you describe the effect of not having an established definition of Federal program on both transparency and the ability to conduct oversight?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I mean, it's very problematic not having this definition. We were charged in law by the Congress 5 years ago to produce an annual report on overlap, duplication, and fragmentation in the Federal Government. It took us great pains and time and effort to come up with an inventory. For example, we identified, after a lot of work and a lot of digging, 82 programs that provided assistance for teacher quality. Not even the Department of Education had a comprehensive list of all these programs. There are 160 programs in the housing area that we eventually unearthed, but even then we couldn't tell how much spending was associated with these programs. So this is it's an impediment from several means, Congressman. Number one, you and other policy members of Congress in making decisions can't tell what the aggregate Federal investment is in a related set of programs. This is problematic if you're trying to decide priorities and make decisions, also knowing whether you're getting a return on the investment. The other problem we found was there wasn't a lot of data on evaluating the success and outcomes of Federal programs. So you didn't have a lot of good inventory of the programs. You didn't have a good listing of the spending associated with the programs and what you were getting as outcomes for the programs. This is not a way to run a government. You need to have that information.
And so implementing the Data Act would be very difficult for OMB as well without this definition of a program.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's one of my recommendations in our testimony today, is they accelerate the Data Act with the Government Performance and Results Modernization Act passed in 2010 required OMB to come up with an inventory of Federal programs. They've not yet done that. They've allowed a lot of flexibility to the agencies, and the agencies implemented it in different ways, and so you can't compare across departments and agencies. So they agreed with our recommendation then and said they were going to defer implementation until the Data Act was in place, which I thought was a reasonable position, but we need to get it done, and it's not yet done.
I guess then I'd slide over here, Mr. Mader, and ask you why has OMB then not created a Federal program inventory to date?
Mr. Congressman, my understanding was that at the time that OMB attempted to create the inventory, they took an approach that basically went out to, and let's say the 24 major departments across government, and asked them to identify within their particular organization what programs, what rose to the program level. And then when they brought all of that data back and looked at the 24, what they couldn't do, and I think this goes to an earlier comment about duplication and overlap, is you couldn't actually see across the 24 where there were common expenditures against a particular activity. For example, there are programs that exist and are executed in different departments. They weren't able to link them because everybody defined what was important to them as a program. So
When it was action and activity, is that what you're saying?
well, they identified a program, but they didn't identify a program so that it was consistent with another program in a different department.
Okay.
So there was inconsistency, so you couldn't crosswalk that. What we're doing now is we have right now 3,800 plus program activities. And in the Data Act, what we're doing is actually refining them and ensuring that everybody understands the definition of those program activities. If you think about program activities and you think about a pyramid, to us, the program sits on top of that, where you would have multiple program activities that would aggregate up to a broader definition of program. And as we...
But you are defining those programs now?
We have not started yet, Congressman, because our goal is first to perfect, and we're starting to perfect the program activities, get that right across the government, and then start looking at, so when we look at the breadth of these 3,000 plus program activities, how do you aggregate that up to fewer? Because there will be fewer than 3,000 if you bring the definition up.
Well, my time has expired, but if I could ask just an expected date of getting to that point where you have that list of programs, is there any timeline you have on it now, based upon what you're doing already with the activities?
We don't have a timeline yet, but what we have said is that we're going to start looking at, you know, can we start that activity sometime in the new fiscal year so that we run it concurrent? But as I've told Senator Lankford recently, the same people that are implementing the Data Act will have to do this. And it's a matter of prioritization and also the fact that program activity is foundational to program. So while we may be able to launch the effort, our sense is that won't be finished until after May of 2017.
Whoa. Mr. Chairman, I guess I would say with the taxpayer right to know proposal with the Data Act in place now, I would encourage you to bump that up in aggressive work to get those programs defined. That's the only way we gain control, as I understand it, gain control on what the size, scope, cost, and responsibility of government is. I yield back.
Thank you. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I've been in Congress for 7 months, I think that's it, and my staff makes fun of me because I say the word outrageous a lot. Because as I learn more about how our government operates, it's pretty outrageous. And something as simple as understanding how the federal government spends money, I would think we'd be able to answer that question, and we can't. And I recognize the four of y'all are involved in trying to get us to a point where we can answer that question. And my understanding, and Mr. Lieber, I think the philosophy that y'all are using to try to solve this problem is a good one. And we recognize that there's 57 pieces of data that we want to track, and that every agency may have one of those 57 pieces in a different database that doesn't talk to each other. Now, for me, it doesn't take 2 years to map that, right? And so my first question is, what is the deadline for the agencies to just identify those 57 pieces of information, whether they have it or not, or how they're going to get it? When's the next, when is there a deadline for them to identify that?
So what we have done in the guidance that we set out on May 8th was we laid out the 8 steps we want agencies to go through, and as I've mentioned, they're in the process of doing that right now. From that process, they put small teams together, and I think this is one of the values of the approach we're taking. It doesn't take lots of people to do this. You just need a small number of knowledgeable people to sit down and sort of look at the systems. From that effort, we'll have a much better sense of the level of the degree of difficulty to actually get to that end state. What we have done, and also part of that May 8th announcement, was by the end of this summer, agencies, early September, agencies are asked to come back what their agency implementation plan will be. So after they've done their sort of assessment, they're going to come back and they're going to say, this is what the degree of difficulty is. these are the resources that are necessary in order to do it.
So
and this is the
what
timeframe.
resources do they need in order to look through their databases to find out that there's 50, where that 57 piece of information is? And Mr. Mader, you said at the beginning, and I wasn't around when the Data Act was passed. I think it's a good thing, and we're moving in the right direction. But $3 million to get 24 federal agencies to map 56 pieces of information to a single database does not require 2 years and $300 million. This is something that I've spent time doing in the private sector, and what are we using the $300 million for?
Mr. Chairman, that was a CBO mark. The administration asked for $94 million in 16, and
So what are we going to use the $94 million for, or $84 million?
And the House appropriations have only allocated $25 million for 4 agencies. And I think when you think about, let's talk.
Well, there's programmers on staff, right, already in some of these agencies. They're collecting the information.
The information, Mr. Chairman, is being collected. There's a financial system that collects and reports information. There are acquisition systems that collect
and somebody's maintaining these systems. Somebody's maintaining these systems already. Somebody is already putting data in these systems. Why do we need more people, more resources to come in? Because basically this is going to be, you're going to identify some database tables and which attributes within those tables, and run a SQL query and generate that to some place that sends it to usspending.gov. Right? The solution is quite simple. The real problem, in my opinion, is the data that's already been entered. Because now we're going to have to go back through in 24 agencies, in 56 different pieces of information. Folks have put in a lot of different data and probably done it the wrong way. So going back and cleaning up the data is going to be a challenge. And Mr. Daddario, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on how we solve that problem.
I think that the agencies need to do the identification, as you say. I don't think it should require a lot of resources to identify whether they have the 57 data elements or not. The question is, what's the gap between what they currently provide and what they need to do in order to come into compliance with the standards and ensure the quality of the data? There's a lot of money being spent now by the federal government to produce inaccurate, incomplete data. And I think that the money, we also ought to look as to whether some of the money that's currently being spent for the systems, our estimate is there was about, this current fiscal year, about $900 million spent for financial management systems upgrades across the federal government. Some of that money potentially could be reprioritized to come into compliance with these standards.
Amen, brother. Help us identify these things, because and know this, and I recognize the endeavor that y'all are taking, right? And also make sure the agencies that you're working with, because y'all got to create the framework. Y'all have already hit the timelines that you're supposed to hit, good on y'all. But the agencies better make sure that they're giving you the information that y'all need in order to move forward, because this will be something that we continue to look at as we go forward in executing our oversight role, because this really is outrageous that we don't know how much money is being spent, and we're spending money on poking voodoo dolls when we're hangry to see if you poke it more than not. And this is the kind of stuff that needs to stop. This is the kind of stuff that I think the folks that we represent expect us to fix, and we're going to need y'all's help to do that. But also know we're watching. We're going to continue to watch, and if there's folks that are having, if there's agencies that y'all are having difficulty with, please let me know. Any further questions? Ranking Member. I'd like to thank our witnesses for taking the time to appear before us today. If there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittees stand adjourned.